The general stopped dead in the doorway. He had walked out of the headquarters building with his security detail at a brisk, purposeful pace, the kind of pace a man with a full calendar and no patience for interruptions uses when moving between obligations. Then he saw the man sitting near the firing line, and he stopped so abruptly that the aide behind him nearly walked into his back. For one full second the general just stood there. Then he straightened, shoulders back, chin level, and he raised his right hand to the brim of his cap in a salute so precise, so deliberate, so completely at odds with everything the contractors on the range had spent the last 40 minutes doing that the entire line went quiet. The man being saluted was wearing a faded flannel shirt and old jeans. He had a cracked leather jacket over the flannel, and on the left breast of that jacket, nearly invisible with age, was a small cloth patch that one of the contractors had called a joke 20 minutes ago. The man nodded once in return. He didn't salute back. He didn't stand. He just nodded, the way a man nods at something that is appropriate and expected. The general turned to the contractors with an expression that had no interest whatsoever in being diplomatic. Hit that like button. Drop your city in the comments. I want to know where you're watching from tonight. David Reeves had driven to the range in a 2011 Toyota Camry with a cracked passenger side mirror and a back seat that held 3 library books and a reusable grocery bag. He had driven with the window down despite the October cold because he preferred outside air to recirculated air, a preference built over years of spending long stretches in places where the air moved and smelled like dust and altitude and the specific absence of civilization. He was 38 years old. He had been medically retired for 14 months. The shoulder had been the official reason, a chronic injury accumulated over many years and many rooftops, the kind of damage that accretes slowly in connective tissue and announces itself all at once. But the honest reason was that his body had finally presented its full invoice, and the number on it was not negotiable. He didn't argue. He signed the paperwork, accepted the medical board findings, and drove north to a small house in the Virginia foothills that he had purchased specifically because the nearest neighbor was half a mile away and the nearest traffic light was 8 miles further. He had a vegetable garden in the back that he took seriously. He had a dog named Quill, a large brown mutt of no specific heritage and considerable personality. He read. He slept a consistent 8 hours. He went to the farmer's market on Saturday mornings and knew everyone who ran a stall there by name. He was doing, by any reasonable assessment, extremely well. His neighbors thought he was some kind of analyst. Something with the government, maybe. There was the general sense that whatever he had done, it involved classified clearances and long absences, and a certain deliberate vagueness when the subject came up at neighborhood barbecues. He was polite about it, the way people with actual secrets are polite about them. Not dramatically, not evasively, but with the comfortable ease of a man who has long since stopped thinking about it as a secret and simply thinks of it as information that belongs to a different context. The jacket was the one piece of the old life that had followed him into the new one without intent. He had grabbed it off a hook in the equipment room on his last day. The way you grab things that have become background furniture after enough years. Not sentimental, not deliberate, just the automatic reach for a familiar object. It had been a working jacket for the last 4 years of his career, worn in planning rooms and on transport aircraft, and in the cold mornings of various overwatch positions, and it smelled faintly of aviation fuel and military-grade detergent in a way that never entirely washed out. The patch had been given to him by his team commander at the end of his 3rd deployment with the unit. Not presented at a ceremony. There were no ceremonies in that unit's culture because ceremonies required witnesses and the unit did not solicit witnesses. Just handed to him across a table in a planning room with a nod and no particular speech. David had sewn it on himself, badly, which was why the stitching was uneven at the lower left corner. He never took it off. He never thought much about it. The thing about the kind of work David had done for 16 years was that it left no obvious marks, no visible scars, or rather, the scar on his collarbone, the one on the back of his left calf, the 2 on his right forearm. None of them were readable to anyone who didn't know what they were looking at. He moved easily. He didn't startle. He slept without apparent disturbance. He was, to every acquaintance and neighbor who knew him, a quiet, self-contained man in his late 30s who had apparently done something military and was now happily doing nothing in particular. What he had done, specifically, was this. For 16 years, across 31 operational deployments, across terrain ranging from urban rooftops in Fallujah to mountain overwatch positions in Kunar province to environments he was still legally prohibited from naming, David Reeves had been a designated marksman, then a senior sniper, then, for the last 7 years, a Tier 1 sniper instructor for a special mission unit whose name did not appear in official records and whose operational history was classified at a level most generals would never have access to. He had 153 confirmed hits. The documentation lived in a system requiring 2 separate clearances and a third authentication, and the number of people cleared to access it was smaller than the roster of most suburban Little League teams. He had never told anyone outside that system what the number was. He had been asked once by a journalist who had somehow found his name attached to a declassified incident report. David had looked at the journalist with the same flat, unreadable patience he had once used to wait out 12-hour Overwatch windows, and then said, "I think you have the wrong person," and walked away. He drove to the Meridian Tactical Facility on a Tuesday because General Harmon had asked him to. That was the entire reason. Harmon, a former 4-star who had run the Joint Special Operations Task Force that deployed David's unit for 6 of those 16 years, had called 2 weeks prior about a consulting arrangement, specifically a curriculum review for the facility's Advanced Marksmanship Instruction Program, which Harmon had built after retiring and which was now considered the most rigorous private tactical training operation in the country. David had said he'd think about it. Harmon had said Tuesday at 10 worked if David was interested. David had said he'd be there. He arrived 12 minutes early, which was a habit. The facility director's assistant had his name on the log and asked him to wait near the main range while Harmon finished a meeting running long. David said that was fine. He walked to the range, sat down on a bench near the far end of the firing line, and took out his phone to read an article about heirloom tomato cultivation. That was when the contractors arrived. There were 6 of them. They came through the range gate in a way that communicated through the specific mechanics of how 6 men can move through a space, that they considered the space theirs. The gear made a statement before any of them spoke. Custom plate carriers, precision rifles with optics that cost more than most cars, gloves with the fingers cut off at the second knuckle in the specific way that men who want to look tactical cut them. 2 of them had earpieces. All of them had the broad, assembled look of men who spent significant resources on appearing to be dangerous. They were PMCs, private military contractors, running a qualification drill under a Meridian tactical contract. Former service, most of them, by the look of the builds and the specific way they occupied physical space. But former service of a particular kind, the kind where you knew the job's language, the equipment, the cadence, but had not been selected for or had not survived the particular filter that separated certain categories of operator from the broader category. David noted all of this in approximately the time it took him to look up from his phone when the gate opened. He went back to the article about tomatoes. The first comment came from the man who turned out to be the lead contractor, a large, thick-necked individual named Braxton, whose gear was the most expensive and whose voice was the loudest, which was the specific inverse of how the genuine hierarchy of dangerous men tended to arrange itself. "Whoa!" Braxton stopped 3 feet from David's bench. He was looking at David with the exaggerated puzzlement of a man performing confusion for an audience. Did we get a civilian in here? Who let the civilian in?" His crew processed the observation and responded with the laughter of men who understood the structure of this particular performance. David looked up from his phone. He looked at Braxton with the expression of a man who has just noticed a weather update he doesn't find particularly surprising. Then he looked back at his phone. "Hey," Braxton moved a step closer. "I'm talking to you, Chief. Who are you here with? This is a private facility. You need an escort to be on the range." "I have an appointment," David said, without looking up. "An appointment." Braxton repeated it the way people repeat things when they want the repetition to sound like a demonstration of absurdity. He turned to his crew. "He has an appointment." The crew responded as expected. Braxton turned back. "What kind of appointment, delivery? Because I don't know if you noticed, but this isn't a UPS hub." David looked up again. He held Braxton's gaze for one measured second, the kind of second that has weight and duration beyond its clock value, then looked back at his phone. "With the facility director," David said. "General Harmon," Braxton said, with the proprietary confidence of a man who was on first-name terms with important people and wanted that known. "Yeah, I know who runs this place. And I know he doesn't take walk-in appointments from—" a sweep of the hand that took in the flannel shirt, the old jeans, the cracked jacket, whatever this is. One of the other contractors, younger, with a fresh high and tight and the specific eagerness of someone not yet senior enough to lead ridicule, but desperate to participate, leaned in and looked at the patch on David's jacket. "Ghost Squad," he said. He read it like it was written in a foreign language. He turned to Braxton. "What is that, a paintball team?" The crew laughed again. "Man, where'd you get that jacket?" Braxton said, shaking his head with the fond, condescending amusement of someone who considered themselves an authority on military credentialing. "They're selling veteran cosplay at the thrift store now?" David had looked back at his phone. He was reading about winter soil preparation. He had found over the years that there was almost nothing a person could say to him that required an immediate response, and that the specific restraint of not providing that response was, in many contexts, the most effective tool available. "You need to head back to the lobby, Chief," Braxton said. His voice had shifted from performance to something slightly more businesslike, the shift that happens when an audience has been adequately warmed up and it's time to actually resolve the situation. "Seriously, you're in the way." "I'll move when my appointment starts," David said. Braxton's jaw tightened. He was not accustomed to direct non-compliance from people he had decided were below him, which was a significant professional blind spot for a man in his line of work. "You want to fire a few rounds while you wait?" one of the younger contractors said, as a joke to his companion, nodding at the row of precision rifles staged at the line. "Maybe he'd like to try the SR-25. General laughter. David looked up from his phone at the rifle in question, a Knight's Armament SR-25 with a Schmidt and Bender scope, staged for the qualifier drill. He looked at it for a moment. "Actually," David said, "yes." The laughter stopped. Braxton stared at him. "What?" "I'd like to fire a few rounds while I wait," David said. He said it in the same tone he might use to ask for the check at a restaurant. "If that's all right." Braxton looked at his crew. He looked back at David with the particular expression of a man who has decided that a situation has gone from mildly entertaining to actively requiring correction. "Get up," Braxton said. David looked at him. "Get up. I'm walking you out. You don't belong on this range, and you're not touching a $60,000 precision system because you think it'd be fun to play with. Let's go." He reached out and put his hand on David's arm. The grip was firm and directing. The hold a man uses when he has decided that a person needs to be moved and is comfortable enough in his own physical authority to make that decision on behalf of someone else. David looked at the hand on his arm. He looked at it the way you look at something that is technically present but not yet requiring a response. Then the door to the headquarters building opened. General Malcolm Harmon came out at a brisk walk, the pace of a man with a full calendar and no patience for interruptions, with his aide and 2 facility security staff behind him. He was 61, silver-haired, with the straight-backed bearing of a man who had worn a uniform for 34 years and whose spine had permanently retained the information. He saw the man near the firing line. He stopped, not the polite hesitation of recognition, a full, abrupt stop so complete that the aide behind him nearly walked into his back. For one full second, he just stood there. Then his shoulders came back, chin level, right hand to the brim of his cap, a salute so crisp and precise and deliberate that it looked, in the context of the range and the gear and the afternoon, like a different category of action from everything that had preceded it. David nodded once. Harmon dropped his hand. He crossed the range in 14 steps, and the expression on his face as he covered that ground was the expression of a man who had already fully assessed a situation and arrived at a conclusion about it before reaching his destination. He looked at Braxton's hand on David's arm. "Take your hand off him," Harmon said. His voice was not raised. It didn't need to be. It had the specific resonance of 34 years of having things done when he spoke. Braxton removed his hand as if the sleeve had burned him. Harmon turned to face the 6 contractors. They had arranged themselves, instinctively, into the posture of men who were beginning to feel the particular discomfort of having profoundly misjudged a situation. "I heard approximately the last 4 minutes of what you said to this man," Harmon said. He said it without visible emotion, which was worse than anger. "I'd like to give you all the opportunity to understand what you did before I decide what to do about your contract." He gestured at the patch on David's jacket. "That patch," Harmon said, "belongs to a classified special mission unit that does not appear in any public record and whose existence the Department of Defense has neither confirmed nor denied. The number of living personnel who have served with that unit and earned the right to wear it can be counted without running out of fingers." He paused. "This man is one of them." The range was very quiet. David Reeves spent 16 years as a Tier 1 designated marksman and senior sniper for that unit. He has 31 operational deployments across 5 theaters of operation. He has 153 confirmed engagements. Harmon let the number land and then continued, at exactly the same pace, as if he were reading from a report. "His records are classified at a level that the majority of active duty generals in this building do not have clearance to access." Nobody said anything. Braxton's mouth was open in the specific way of a man who has tried to locate an appropriate response and found the search area empty. "The joke patch," Harmon said, looking at the younger contractor who had made the comment, "represents things that you are not cleared to know about and have not done things that would make you eligible to do." He turned back to David. "I apologize for keeping you waiting," he said. The register had changed completely, not warmth exactly, but the specific respect of a man acknowledging a peer he does not take for granted. "I've got the curriculum materials ready in the conference room. We can head over whenever you're ready." "In a minute," David said. He stood from the bench. He was not a large man, 5'11", 185 pounds, built in the lean, functional way of someone whose body had always been a tool rather than a statement. He rolled his shoulder once, a gesture that was habit rather than preparation. He walked to the firing line. He looked at the rifles staged there. He passed the SR-25 with the Schmidt and Bender scope. He passed a second precision rifle with a custom suppressor and an illuminated reticle. He stopped at the end of the line, at a standard issue M110, accurate, reliable, unmodified, with standard iron sights. No magnification, no stabilization, no warm-up round. He picked it up. He checked the chamber. He adjusted his stance, not the elaborate, scaffolded position of a competition shooter, but something simpler and more settled. The posture of a man who has had this specific conversation with this specific type of equipment so many times that it no longer requires conscious thought. He looked downrange. The target was 500 yards out. A standard silhouette, center mass highlighted, in competition terms, in qualification terms, in any formal assessment framework. 500 yards without magnification on a cold barrel was a number that required significant preparation. Required a confirmed 0, required known environmental data, wind, temperature, elevation, humidity, the specific personality of the ammunition lot. David raised the M110. He fired 5 times. The shots came in a rhythm that was not hurried and not slow. The rhythm of a man doing something that has the same relationship to effort that a master carpenter has to driving a nail. Present, precise, unhurried, already complete before it finishes. He put the rifle down on the table with the careful, deliberate respect of a man returning something that belongs to someone else. He looked downrange. At 500 yards, through the range's spotting scope, which Harmon's aide was already at, because Harmon had positioned him there before David had even reached the line, The 5 shots occupied a grouping roughly the diameter of a tennis ball, centered exactly at the point of aim. 5 rounds, iron sights, 500 yards, cold barrel, no preparation. The aide looked up from the spotting scope. He looked at Harmon. He did not say anything. The expression on his face said everything. David picked up his jacket from the bench. He put it on. He straightened the patch with one finger, the small, faded Ghost Squad patch that 6 contractors had laughed at 40 minutes ago. He looked at Braxton, not with triumph, not with contempt, with the same flat, informational expression he'd had looking at his phone when the first comment had arrived. "Good luck with your qualifier," David said. He turned to Harmon. "Ready when you are, sir." They walked toward the headquarters building together. The security detail fell in at a respectful distance. The aide followed, still carrying the expression of a man who had just watched something recalibrate his baseline assumptions about what was possible. The contractors stood at the firing line in the specific silence of 6 men who have run out of things to say. Braxton looked at the target downrange. He looked at the rifle on the table. The standard issue M110, no modifications, no optic, sitting exactly where David had set it with that deliberate, almost ceremonial care. He looked at the doorway through which David and Harmon had disappeared. He looked at all 3 of these things and said nothing. He had been doing this work for 9 years. He had trained under former SEALs, former Rangers, former Force Recon Marines. He had fired tens of thousands of rounds in a dozen countries. He had qualified on platforms that most military personnel never touched. He was, by the credentialing systems that governed his professional world, genuinely good at this. And genuinely good at this was not a small thing. He had earned it. He took it seriously. He picked up the spotting scope and put his eye to it. He looked at the 5-round grouping at 500 yards. He stayed at the scope for a long time. When he put it down, his face had the quality of a man doing internal arithmetic that is not going in a favorable direction. The grouping was roughly the diameter of a tennis ball. 5 rounds, cold barrel, iron sights, 500 yards. In competition marksmanship, at the highest civilian level, that grouping required a known zero, a confirmed dope card, environmental data, a staged and settled position, and a minimum of 3 warm-up rounds to seat the barrel. Even then, at 500 yards on irons, a tennis ball grouping would draw a crowd. David Reeves had done it in the time it took to walk to the line, pick up the rifle, and breathe. Braxton put down the spotting scope. He looked at his crew. They looked back at him with the expressions of men who were waiting for him to say something that would provide some structural framework for what they had all just witnessed. And he could not find that thing. He didn't say anything. The youngest contractor, the one who had asked about the patch, who had made the paintball comment, whose eagerness to participate in the ridicule had been the most visible, sat down slowly on the bench where David had been sitting. He looked at the range. He looked at his hands in his fingerless gloves. He was 26 years old, 3 years in the industry. He had come into private contracting from Army infantry, good service record, 2 deployments, legitimately skilled. He had gotten into the custom gear and the high-end optics the way most young contractors did, because the gear was what separated you visually from people who didn't know what they were doing, and visual separation from people who didn't know what they were doing had felt important when he was 23 and newly discharged and trying to establish himself in a field where credibility was everything. He had never considered that the visual separation could also work in reverse, that the man with the oldest jacket and the most faded patch could be the one the general saluted. He thought about the patch. He thought about the word classified and what it meant in a real operational context versus the way he had seen it used on merchandise at military surplus stores. He thought about the number 153 and what the distribution of those engagements looked like across 16 years, across 31 deployments in theaters he likely did not have the clearance to know about. He thought about the general's face in the moment he saw David near the firing line. Not recognition exactly, but something more specific than recognition. Something like the expression you see in the face of a man who has spent his career working with forces he does not command so much as coordinate with, and who has learned to recognize at a glance the difference between a dangerous person and whatever category sits above that. He had been very loud this morning. He had been very loud and very certain and very public about both. The quiet man had been reading about tomatoes. He sat there for a long time. Eventually Braxton said, "Let's run the qualifier." They ran it with the chastened, attentive focus of men who have been recently and thoroughly reminded that the thing they built their confidence on has categories they have not yet accessed and may never access, and that this is worth knowing about yourself. They shot well. They always shot well. But every one of them, at some point during the drill, let his gaze drift downrange to the 5-shot grouping still visible on the paper target at 500 yards, and every one of them sat for a moment with the same thought, the specific recalibrating thought that arrives when you understand that the floor of your expertise and the ceiling of someone else's are not in the same building or even in the same city. It was not a comfortable thought, but it was a useful one. In the conference room, David and Harmon sat across a table covered with curriculum binders and range assessment data. Harmon's aide brought 2 coffees and removed himself without being asked, which was what made him a good aide. Harmon opened the first binder. "The intermediate marksmanship program needs the most work. We're getting inconsistency in the 500 to 800-yard curriculum. The fundamentals are there, but the cold barrel work is underdeveloped," David said. "Yes. You're teaching the shot. You're not teaching the waiting." David turned a page in the binder, scanning the drill sequence. "Everything past 400 yards is mostly waiting. The shot itself is already done before you pull the trigger. It's been decided by everything that happened in the 30 minutes before. If they don't know how to wait correctly, they don't know how to shoot. They know how to fire." Harmon looked at him. "There's a difference. Significant difference. Firing is mechanical. Shooting is... It's the absence of everything that isn't the shot. It's the state you arrive at when you've eliminated all the interference." David set the binder down. "Your current curriculum teaches mechanics very well. It doesn't teach students how to become quiet enough to use them." Harmon was quiet for a moment. "That's going to be a difficult thing to build a curriculum around. Quietness." "Most of the real things are difficult to build curricula around," David said. "That's usually how you know they're real." Harmon smiled, not broadly, but with the specific recognition of a man hearing something expressed that he had known for years without finding the right words for it. "How long to design the module? A week? 10 days if you want it done properly. I want it done properly. 10 days then." David turned another page. "What's the current washout rate on the 500-yard cold qualifier?" Harmon told him. David looked at the number for a moment. "We can cut that significantly." "By how much?" "By however much you want, within reason. The limitation isn't the students. It's the framework you're giving them to work in." He turned another page. "The cold barrel environment is a mental environment before it's a physical one. If you teach that first, the physical part takes care of itself." Harmon leaned back in his chair. He had spent 34 years in the military managing people who operated at the highest levels of their profession, and he had learned to recognize, in the way they talked about their work, the specific register of genuine mastery. It sounded like this: unhurried, precise, interested in the problem rather than in being seen to be interested. David Reeves sounded exactly like this. He had sounded exactly like this every time Harmon had talked to him for 16 years. "I'll have the assistant set up access for you starting Monday," Harmon said. "Full range access, all curriculum materials." "That works," David said. He drove home in the Camry with the window down, the October air cold and moving, smelling like leaf decay and distant rain. The library books were still in the back seat. He had a farmer's market on Saturday. He needed to turn his winter beds before the ground hardened. He thought about the qualifier group he'd fired, the way he thought about most things he'd done in the course of a day, briefly, practically, filing it and moving on. It had been a clean 5 rounds. The wind at ground level had been negligible. He'd felt a slight leftward push at about 300 yards that he'd accounted for instinctively, the way you account for things you've done enough times that the body handles them before the mind arrives. He thought about the contractor who had called the patch a joke. He thought about the specific progression of expressions on the kid's face, the confidence, the performance, the moment of arrested movement when Harmon walked out, the thing that had come after. David had watched a lot of men in his career go through various versions of that progression. The ones who came out of it better were the ones who let what came after actually land, who sat with the recalibration instead of immediately plastering it over with something more comfortable. He didn't know which kind that kid was. He'd likely never find out. He hoped he was the first kind. He turned onto the county road that led up into the foothills. The trees on either side had gone deep orange and red, the specific colors of a Virginia October that he had spent most of his career looking at on the other side of the world and thinking about. He was home in 40 minutes. Quill met him at the door with the specific joy of a dog who had decided, years ago, that David's return from any absence, trip to the store, meeting at a former general's tactical facility, 16-month operational deployment, warranted the exact same level of celebration. This had always struck David as a reasonable philosophy. He fed the dog. He made dinner. He sat on the back porch in the dark for a while, listening to the tree frogs in the woodlot. He was not thinking about the range, not the grouping, not Braxton's face, not the number Harmon had cited. He was thinking about the winter beds and whether the soil amendment he'd ordered had arrived and whether he'd have time to turn everything before the weekend. Small, real, entirely concrete things, the things that waited for him when the larger things were done. The best shooters David had ever known were all the same in one specific way. They were quiet. Not quiet as in silent, not quiet as in reserved or cold or closed off. Quiet as in unbothered by the noise. Quiet as in certain of themselves at a frequency that didn't need to be broadcast because it didn't need confirmation from anyone else. The shooting was the same way. The best work happened in the absence of urgency, in the long discipline of waiting and knowing, and the specific, practiced trust of letting the body do what the body had been taught. You could not be loud and be excellent at that particular skill. The two things were simply incompatible. Noise required energy. Excellent long-range marksmanship required the redirection of all energy into one channel, one moment, one point of contact between breath and trigger. The contractors on the range had been very loud. David had been thinking about curriculum modules, about soil amendment, about a dog's uncomplicated joy. The grouping at 500 yards had been what it always was, the natural consequence of being completely, absolutely quiet. The rest was just noise. Hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel if you're here for stories about quiet excellence and the kind of people who never need to announce what they carry. Leave a comment. Have you ever watched someone get humbled by the person they least expected? Tell us what you saw.